Hi, what's up? Hello, my name is Liz, and you are watching For Booking Out Loud. So, SherlockAthon is over, and that means it's time for a wrap-up. SherlockAthon went from the middle of October to the middle of November. Around 30-ish days to finish their 11 prompts. And throughout this time and throughout this readathon, I've read 10 books for a total of 4,117 pages. And instead of doing a month-long reading vlog, which would have been a lot, especially as work picked up and I was going in and out of school for different days, depending on which students were called in, I decided just to do a wrap-up of the books and the summaries and how I either liked them or didn't like them. Welcome to my video. So again, there are 11 prompts, and I'm just gonna tell you which books I picked for each prompt and how I went through it. To make it more streamlined, I'm gonna use this kind of as my wrap-up video like I do every month and timestamp them for each prompt. So if you need some help, either go through the video or look in the description down below. And just as some help too, I always put the books I talk about in my description. So if you just want to see if the books are interesting enough for you, you can look down there as well. And also, I need some help myself. So for the Mrs. Hudson prompt, a book by a Scottish author or based in Scotland, and the bonus prompt, Toby, so the group book, which was The Hounds of Baskerville. I tried to read this beautiful Sherlock Holmes book, and if you watched my recent reading vlog, you could see my journey reading almost the whole book, but not quite. This book contains The Hounds of Baskerville, so I did say I completed that book and that prompt, but I did DNF this book as a whole. I got through quite a bit of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and it is, well, let me just rewind. This book is broken up into 4 parts, and basically it's the parts that Sherlock Holmes was released in The Strand, which was the newspaper that released these stories. You have the first part, which is the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. You have the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, which is the second part. The Hounds of Baskerville is the third part, which was a book. And then the fourth part is the return of Sherlock Holmes. So I got through part 1, 2, and of course part 3, The Hounds of Baskerville. And I got through 3 stories of the return of Sherlock Holmes, and I just couldn't handle it. I thought about it, and I've kind of discussed it with others, and I felt that the stories were too short, and the writing was just such that I couldn't connect to any of the characters in the mystery. They were very surface level, and that includes Sherlock Holmes and Watson, John Watson, and even some of the recurring characters. And it just boils down to, I think I've been entrenched in the westernization or the modernization of these characters, where you do get to learn others' interpretations and so much more about the characters that might not be true, that I was expecting more from reading the original and I just didn't get it. And especially reading them in like a serial manner wasn't advantageous to me enjoying the story. So as of right now, DNFing the book and not really enjoying it. And I might pick it up at a later date when I can sit down and maybe read 1 or 2 stories at a time and not try to marathon them. So there was that. The next book I want to talk about is The Retelling, a diverse retelling by an own voice author. So I kind of went rogue on this, and I kind of just chose a book by a diverse author. It's not a retelling at all, but I decided on Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. This book has been going around BookTube since the summer when it was released, or the arcs were released, and I think partly because it has a gorgeous cover, and it does have a gorgeous cover, and secondly because the book is it's a hard topic to talk about, but it's an important one to talk about. It follows this girl, Enchanted Jones, who gets into a relationship with a much, much older star, and it turns into a very, very abusive relationship. Jackson does not say that the story is based on R. Kelly, but it has very similar vibes to the R. Kelly story and trial. Nevertheless, whether it was based on R. Kelly or not, this story has a ton of themes of abusive relationships, drugs, sex, rape, underage relationships. And it's something that we need to talk about, and we need to have an open discussion on and how to handle it. And it was a tough book to read, but I'm really glad I did. I can't remember if I gave it a 3.5 or a 4 stars, but this was an incredibly good book to read. I would not read it if you do not want to, if you are not comfortable reading about sex, drugs, and rape, basically, and underage relationships, point blank. But if you are, I would really pick this book up. The next prompt I'm going to talk about is Inspector Gregson, a book you hope to learn something from. And I took that as a nonfiction book. And I did read this book in November, so nonfiction November. And on top of that, I'm also in the middle of reading a whole bunch of Stephen King, so I thought what better time than to pick up On Writing by Stephen King. And I'm really, really glad that I did, because this book is part memoir and part writing course by Stephen King. It was released in 2000, but he wrote it mostly in 1999 when he had a really major life-threatening car accident, and he had to go into intense surgeries, and he was just in a lot of pain, and it does reflect in the later chapters what he's going through. I am not particularly a writer or an aspiring writer. I just don't find a lot of joy in it, and that's fine. I've accepted it. I get to read a lot of high school essays, and yay for me. So I might be taking some of these passages for that. But I particularly enjoyed the first half of the book, which is more of the memoir side, about how Stephen King became a writer and his journey throughout writing, and where he found his joy of writing and just his process until 1999. In particular, I've been trying to find a reason for a book that I've read in the summer called The Tommyknockers, and he gives a really good explanation for that, and I was like, duh. That's why he wrote it, and that's why, and that is what it's about. So I'm really glad I wrote that, wow. I'm really glad I read this just for that book's explanation. Given I probably could have read something online, but I like hearing it from his own words. So if you're looking for a good memoir or just a good writing course from a writer that, prolific writer, I would look into On Writing. Now, the next prompt is Irene Adler, or a book written by a woman. Now, this is different than what was on my TBR list, just because, again, this past 4 weeks, I had been going into my school, and a librarian suggested this book to me for my students, and I needed to read it. It's called Sanctuary Somewhere by Brenna Dimmig, and it's a verse poetry book about a young 17-year-old boy named Osmil, who has dreams of being a meteorologist and going off to college as he enters his senior year, but then quickly finds out that he is undocumented, which he didn't know before. And it's a really short verse poetry book, and you go through it really, really fast, but it was beautiful of finding a future when a fact comes crashing down on a young man, and hope. And it was certainly an interesting read, but it also wasn't an own voices author, and Dimmig also isn't from the Latino community, and she's certainly not undocumented, so it was also a very interesting read in the sense that I knew she herself isn't experiencing any of these emotions in order to be writing this poetry. I picked it up because I knew it was a short book that I could entice my students to read, potentially. But at the same time, I go back and forth, and I had this conversation with my librarian too, if it would be good to even recommend this book to students, knowing these facts about the author and the material that she's writing about. And I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts about that, especially recommending younger students to a book that potentially has these problems as well. Or if you have any recommendations to have an own voices author with this sensitive material. Any help? And then on the reverse side, this next prompt, Professor James Moriarty, read a book with enemies. I read The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, and I absolutely loved it. The reason I picked it for enemies is that, yes, it has enemies. It is about 4 Blackfeet men who, in their last hunting trip together, killed an elk on ground that they shouldn't have, or in a way that they shouldn't have, really. And 10 years later, it comes back to haunt them in gruesome, gruesome ways. I'm not gonna lie, I have been searching for a book or a story that would scare me or make me think for quite a while. And with this book, let me tell you, I have found it. This book is written into 4 parts, which are the 4 ways these men are being hunted like the animal they killed. And Graham Jones does not leave anything to the imagination. I won't tell you that I was necessarily scared while reading this book, but it leaves you thinking and leaves you like, I don't know how he does it, but his descriptions in this book are vivid and they will not leave your mind at all. And this book has achieved what I've been looking for the past couple of months in a horror book. And let me also tell you that I will be looking into Stephen Graham Jones's other stories for sure. I am currently reading Mongrels as a buddy read for Indigathon, and he is a fantastic writer. If you get a chance to pick up one of his books, I say do it without a thought, because you would not be disappointed at all. So the next prompt I want to talk about is Inspector Lestrade. Read a book that's ghostwritten or written under a pen name. And for this book, I decided what better time than to start a reread of the Farseer trilogy with The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. And I have read this book before, but the first time I read it was on my e-reader. And so this time I read it in book form, and I did tab it. I wasn't expecting to, it just kind of happened, and I was not disappointed. I loved it the first time, and that's exactly why I'm doing it the second time. But I forgot how much you are invested into Robin Hobb's characters. I mean, the main character, Fitz, is just... your heart reaches out to him, and you're rooting for him, and you are just so invested into his life in this book that it's incredible. I am so happy I'm starting this reread, and there are so many things that I've forgotten, and I'm so happy I picked this book back up. If you're looking for an epic fantasy read, I highly suggest the Farseer trilogy. It's wonderful. And there's also great animals in this that are characters too. Just wanted to point that out. So the next prompt is Dr. John Watson, a book with a narrator. And I decided to read Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. This book I read because I honestly loved Pride and Prejudice as a classic, as a romance novel. I think I've read it twice now, and I loved it both times. And so I thought I would branch out and read maybe something else by her. Who knows? And I thought Sense and Sensibility was a fine novel. It's about a couple of sisters down on their luck, finding love, along the same lines as Pride and Prejudice. I would say it's okay. I would say pick up Pride and Prejudice before you pick up Sense and Sensibility. I just couldn't find ties to the characters like I could in Pride and Prejudice, and I just wasn't as satisfied with the ending. But again, not a horrible book. And then the next prompt is Sherlock Holmes, read a book with a detective in it. And I read Silence of the Bones by June Ur. And this is a book set in 1800s Korea, where unless you're related or married to women, you are not allowed to touch them if you're a man. So our main character, Sol, is an indentured servant of the police bureau, and she is basically the one woman they've hired in order to touch the dead bodies of women. And a serial killer is afoot, and she has been tasked, well, she takes it upon herself to try to solve the mystery of what these dead bodies are from, who's killing them. And it also brings into question where's her family? And it brings into question of religious beliefs and religious conflicts. And yes, you have this beautiful story of this young girl trying to find herself and discover what's happening with these deaths. It also brings in a lot of historical aspects of this time, which aren't usually explored in Western novels. And so I found this a wonderful tale, a wonderful mystery, and I was honestly on the edge of my seat as I was reading it the whole time. And I'm really, 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 really glad that I picked it up, because I love historical nonfiction. I love historical fiction. And this was just one that was a beautiful story, along with learning so many facts. And I highly suggest it if you have not picked it up. The next two prompts kind of go together. So Mycroft Holmes, read any one book in one room, and Inspector Bradstreet, a book with more than 500 pages. I decided to start reading Tolkien's world again, you know, Lord of the Rings. And what better way to start than with The Hobbit? Because you can't start a world without its origin. And I read this in one room because I read it in one sitting. But it's a wonderful tale. This one is more geared towards children, although I don't think I'd really read it to children now. Although now that I'm thinking about it, I think I was read this in third grade, in my third grade classroom. But I read The Hobbit, and then to do the 500 pages, I'm counting all three of these, Lord of the Rings. So you have The Fellowship, The Two Towers, and Return of the King. I'm counting this as one book because Tolkien actually intended this whole thing to be released as one book and not three. So you technically have part 1, 2, and part 3. And so this is an 1,000-page book. So I think that's over 500. I don't think I need to describe to you what this book is about. You have the one ring to rule them all, and you have a group of hobbits, the unlikely hero, going on a journey to destroy it. Thank you, Frodo and Sam. It's a good tale, and I'm really glad I read it. Definitely interesting verse, poetry, songs, poetry-like, even though it's not always poetry. I mean, you'll have Tolkien describing this beautiful scene, and then you'll have one page of a battle, which in itself is kind of interesting. And it just depends on what you like, whether you like this book or not. And I think it'll take me a while to pick it up again, and I don't think I'll willingly pick it up, but I still want to get through the other books in this world and just complete that. Because I didn't dislike it. It was just interesting. But that's the end of my SherlockAthon book reading. I read a very wide range of books, all the way from nonfiction to fantasy to contemporary to poetry. And I did have a lot of fun. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.